Far across the Pacific Ocean lies a chain of low coral atolls, known as the Marshall Islands. They sit between Hawaii and Australia, spread thinly across a vast stretch of blue water. From above, the islands look fragile, barely rising above the sea. For thousands of years, they were home to thriving island communities, the Marshallese. People learned to live with the ocean, not against it. Canoes carved from breadfruit trees crossed open seas with precision. Navigation relied on stars, waves, and memory rather than instruments. The ocean was a map, and the sky was a guide. Families lived in close-knit communities, bound by kinship and tradition. Land was not owned by individuals, but held collectively through lineage. Every atoll had meaning, history, and ancestral value. Food came from fishing, coconut palms, pandanus, and breadfruit. Life followed the rhythm of tides, seasons, and wind. The islands were remote, but never isolated in culture or identity. Knowledge passed orally from elders to children. Songs, stories, and chants preserved history across generations. This way of life endured for centuries with little outside interference. That changed in the 20th century. Global powers began crossing the Pacific in search of control. During World War I, Germany lost its Pacific territories. Japan assumed control of the Marshall Islands soon after. Under Japanese rule, the islands became militarized outposts. Airstrips, bunkers, and supply bases reshaped the land. The Marshallese had little say in these transformations. World War II brought the islands into direct conflict. Fierce battles were fought across the Pacific theater. The Marshall Islands became strategic stepping stones. In 1944, U.S. forces captured the islands from Japan. Bombardments scarred reefs and shorelines. Civilians endured displacement and uncertainty. When the war ended, the world celebrated peace. But peace did not mean freedom for the islands. The United Nations placed the Marshall Islands under U.S. administration. This was known as a trust territory. Officially, the U.S. was responsible for protection and development. Unofficially, strategic interests dominated decisions. The world had entered the nuclear age. Atomic weapons had just ended the war in Japan. Scientists and military planners rushed to understand this new power. Nuclear testing became a priority. The tests required remote locations far from major cities and global attention. The Marshall Islands appeared on military maps as ideal. They were described as sparsely populated. This description ignored reality on the ground. Entire communities lived on these eight. Their connection to land could not be measured by population numbers. Bikini Atoll was one such community. Families there had lived for generations by the lagoon. In 1946, U.S. officials arrived with a proposal. Islanders were told to temporarily leave their home. They were promised a safe return. The request was framed as a sacrifice for humanity. Few alternatives were offered. The power imbalance was absolute. The islanders agreed, believing the move would be brief. They carried what they could and left everything else behind. Homes, graves, and sacred places were abandoned. Similar relocations followed on other 18. Some islands were left empty, almost overnight. The ocean routes that once brought life now carried uncertainty. Military ships replaced fishing canoes. Scientific equipment replaced village tools. Observation towers rose where palm trees once stood. The land was redefined as a testing ground. The language of strategy replaced the language of home. Most Americans never heard these island names. Fewer still knew people lived there. The Marshallese were not consulted about long-term consequences. Radiation was poorly understood even by experts. Predictions were based on limited data and optimism. Officials believed damage could be contained. The islands were seen as distant and expendable. For the Marshallese, they were irreplaceable. By early 1946, preparations were nearly complete. Ships gathered in Bikini Lagoon. Cameras, instruments, and crews took their positions. Scientists waited to observe the future of warfare. Few considered the future of the islands themselves. The people who once lived there watched from afar. They waited for the promised return. The world focused on power, not consequences. The sky above Bikini Atoll remained calm. The ocean reflected clouds and sunlight. Beneath that calm, history was about to fracture. A countdown had begun, though most never heard it. The islands stood silent, and exposed. What followed would redefine them forever. The test was described as scientific progress. It would soon become something else entirely. The first explosion had not yet happened, but the damage had already begun. A way of life was interrupted. The people were displaced by a decision made elsewhere. The nuclear age demanded a proving ground. The Marshall Islands were chosen, not because they were empty, but because they were distant. And distance made consequences easier to ignore. In 1946, the countdown to irreversible change reached 0. In 1946, the Marshall Islands were officially under United States control as a trust territory. This arrangement was approved by the United Nations after World War II. The stated goal was protection, stability, and eventual self-governance. Strategic military priorities quickly took precedence. The U.S. military needed a place to test nuclear weapons in real conditions. These tests could not be conducted near American cities. They required distance, secrecy, and political control. The Marshall Islands met all three conditions. Bikini Atoll was selected as a primary testing site. It was a ring-shaped coral atoll with a large central lagoon. The lagoon could hold an entire naval fleet. Its isolation made observation easier to control. In February 1946, U.S. officials met with Bikini's leaders. The meeting was conducted through interpreters. Complex scientific risks were not fully explained. Islanders were told the relocation would be temporary. They were told it would help prevent future wars. The choice presented was not equal. Refusing was not treated as a real option. Bikini's population was moved to Runit Atoll. Runit was smaller and less fertile. Food sources there were limited. Fishing conditions were poor. Wheat and Mons, starvation became a concern. The relocation had not been properly planned. Meanwhile, military preparations intensified at Bikini. More than 90 ships were anchored in the lagoon. These included battleships, aircraft carriers, and submarines. Many ships were surplus from World War II. Some had been captured from enemy fleets. They were positioned as test targets. Scientists wanted to study nuclear effects on naval forces. Animals were placed aboard ships for experiments. Pigs, goats, and rats were used as test subjects. Cameras were mounted across islands and ships. Observation bunkers were constructed on nearby Atoll. Thousands of military personnel were involved. The operation was named Operation Crossroads. 2 tests were planned for 1946. The first was an airburst detonation. The second would be detonated underwater. These tests aimed to simulate real combat scenarios. Public attention focused on technological achievement. Newsreels framed the tests as scientific milestones. Few reports mentioned displaced islanders. Even fewer questioned long-term safety. Radiation science was still in early stages. Long-term environmental impact was not well understood. Confidence outweighed caution. Military optimism dominated planning discussions. The tests were scheduled for summer 1946. Weather conditions were carefully monitored. Ships were evacuated of personnel before detonation. Observers watched from miles away. Bikini Atoll itself was empty of its people. Homes stood abandoned near the shoreline. Personal belongings were left behind. Graves and sacred sites remained unprotected. The lagoon became a controlled military zone. Entry was forbidden without authorization. The islanders waited on Runit for updates. Food shortages worsened over time. Requests for relocation assistance were slow to be answered. U.S. officials debated solutions internally. The nuclear schedule moved faster than humanitarian planning. Across the world, attention turned toward the Cold War. Nuclear weapons became symbols of global power. Testing was framed as necessary deterrence. Ethical questions were rarely public. The Marshall Islands remained largely unknown to the public. Their names were difficult to pronounce for foreign audiences. Their people were invisible in strategic calculations. Bikini Atoll was now a laboratory. The ocean around it became an experiment. Scientists believed radiation would dissipate quickly. This assumption would later prove incorrect. As July approached, final checks were completed. Instruments were calibrated. Observation aircraft took their positions. The world prepared to witness nuclear power at sea. Bikini's former residents were not present to see it. They had been moved out of sight. The sky above the atoll remained deceptively calm. Beneath the surface, tension grew. The test was no longer theoretical. It was about to become real. The nuclear age demanded proof. Bikini Atoll was about to provide it. The countdown had begun again. This time, the consequences would be visible. No one yet understood how far they would spread, or how long they would last. The test planners focused on blast radius and shock waves. They did not plan for generations. The Marshallese waited for promised returns. The military waited. But data, two futures stood on opposite sides of the lagoon. One built on power, the other built on loss. The explosion was now inevitable. On July 1st, 1946, the first nuclear test at Bikini Atoll was conducted. It was an airburst detonation known as Test Atoll. The explosion lit the sky above the lagoon. A blinding flash was followed by a towering mushroom cloud. Shockwaves rippled across the ocean surface. Several ships were damaged, but many remained afloat. Military planners judged the results inconclusive. Weeks later, a second test was carried out. This one was detonated underwater. It was called Test Baker. The explosion sent millions of tons of radioactive water into the air. A massive column rose from the lagoon like a hollow cylinder. Radioactive spray rained down on ships and nearby islands. Contamination was far worse than expected. Ships became dangerously radioactive. Many could not be properly decontaminated. Some were eventually sunk at sea. Operation Crossroads ended, but nuclear testing did not. The Marshall Islands remained under U.S. control. Testing expanded beyond Bikini. Inuit Atoll became another major test site. Between 1946 and 1958, dozens of nuclear devices were detonated. Weapon designs grew more powerful with each series. Scientists pursued thermonuclear weapons. These were hydrogen bombs, far stronger than earlier atomic bombs. In the early 1950s, Cold War tensions intensified. Nuclear superiority became a strategic priority. Testing accelerated to match that urgency. On March 1st, 1954, a test called Castle Bravo was conducted. It took place at Bikini Atoll. Castle Bravo was a hydrogen bomb experiment. Scientists predicted a yield of about 5 megatons. The actual yield was 15 megatons. It was the most powerful nuclear test ever conducted by the United States. The explosion was over 1,000 times stronger than Hiroshima. The fireball vaporized parts of the atoll. Kora was turned into radioactive debris. A mushroom cloud rose more than 40 kilometers into the sky. Fallout spread far beyond the expected zone. Wind patterns had been miscalculated. Radioactive particles drifted eastward. They fell on inhabited islands. On Runit Atoll, people awoke to white ash falling from the sky. It coated rooftops, food, and water supplies. Children played in it, unaware of the danger. The substance was radioactive fallout. Islanders experienced skin burns and nausea. Evacuation did not occur immediately. On Runit Atoll, fallout also reached populated areas. Far beyond the Marshall Islands, contamination spread. A Japanese fishing vessel, Lucky Dragon No. 5, was exposed. Its crew suffered radiation sickness. One crew member later died from complications. The incident drew international attention. Public concern over nuclear testing grew. Within the Marshall Islands, exposure continued silently. U.S. officials later acknowledged the fallout was severe. Residents of Runit were evacuated days later. By then, significant exposure had already occurred. Scientists documented radiation levels across the region. Many areas were declared unsafe for habitation. Some islands were permanently altered. Entire landmasses were reshaped by blasts. Craters replaced palm-covered terrain. The lagoon floors were contaminated. Fish populations absorbed radioactive material. Traditional food sources became dangerous. Testing continued for several more years. Each detonation added to cumulative contamination. In total, the U.S. conducted 67 nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands. The combined explosive force exceeded that of many wars. For scientists, the data advanced weapon development. For islanders, the damage accumulated quietly. Many exposures were not immediately visible. Radiation does not announce itself. It leaves no smell or sound. Its effects emerge slowly, over time. Official assurances remained cautiously optimistic. Long-term health consequences were still uncertain. Some officials believed risks were manageable. Others privately expressed concern. Testing officially ended in 1958. By then, entire atolls were uninhabitable. The islands had absorbed years of nuclear fallout. What had been an experiment became a legacy. The explosions were over. The contamination remained. The people would live with the consequences. Many would not learn the full extent for decades. The nuclear age had left its mark, not just on history books, but on bodies, land, and memory. The Marshall Islands were no longer just remote. They were a record of nuclear ambition and of miscalculation. The tests achieved their military goals. They also created an invisible disaster, one that could not be undone. The fire had faded from the sky, but its shadow remained on the islands. When the nuclear tests ended, the danger did not disappear with the explosions. Radiation remained embedded in soil, water, plants, and food chains. Unlike blast damage, radiation left no visible warning. Many islanders were told it was safe to return. Some communities were relocated multiple times. Atoll was declared safe for resettlement in 1957. Families returned to rebuild their homes. Crops were replanted in contaminated soil. Fish were caught from radioactive lagoons. Over time, illnesses began to appear. Thyroid disorders became widespread. Many children developed thyroid nodules. Some required surgery at young ages. Cancers were later diagnosed at unusually high rates. Medical teams documented these conditions in reports. The connection to radiation exposure became increasingly clear. Birth defects were observed in some cases. Miscarriages and stillbirths were reported. Families struggled to understand what was happening. Information was limited and often delayed. Medical care on the islands was minimal. Patients were sometimes transported overseas for treatment. Language barriers complicated communication with doctors. Many islanders felt like test subjects rather than patients. U.S. scientists conducted long-term health studies. Some studies focused more on data collection than treatment. Consent was not always fully informed. Trust between communities and officials eroded. Psychological trauma accompanied physical illness. Fear became part of daily life. Parents worried about feeding their children local food. Elders questioned whether the land was safe. Traditional knowledge could not explain radiation. The invisible threat challenged cultural understanding. In the 1970s, radiation levels were reassessed. New measurements revealed ongoing contamination. Runit was again declared unsafe. Residents were evacuated for a second time. This displacement deepened feelings of betrayal. Promises of safety had failed. Compensation programs were introduced. Payments were often delayed or disputed. Financial support could not replace lost land. Legal processes moved slowly. Documentation requirements were difficult to meet. Some affected individuals were never compensated. Environmental cleanup efforts began. Contaminated soil was removed in select areas. Some debris was buried or contained. Full restoration proved impossible. Radiation decays over time, but not quickly. Some isotopes persist for decades. Others last centuries. The islands became sites of long-term monitoring. Warning signs marked dangerous zones. Access to certain areas remained restricted. Fishing bans were imposed in some regions. Food imports increased dependency on outside supplies. Traditional self-sufficiency was disrupted. Younger generations grew up away from ancestral lands. Cultural transmission weakened with each relocation. Songs and stories lost their geographic anchors. Identity became harder to define. The damage extended beyond physical health. It affected language, memory, and belonging. International awareness slowly increased. Activists and journalists raised concerns. Scientific findings entered public discussion. Nuclear testing faced growing opposition worldwide. Treaties began to limit future tests. These agreements came too late for the Marshall Islands. The harm had already been done. For many islanders, the past was never past. Each illness revived old fears. Each relocation reopened old wounds. The tests were described as historical events. For the Marshallese, they were ongoing realities. Healing required more than medical care. It required acknowledgement. It required accountability. Some progress was made. Much remained unresolved. The islands stood as quiet evidence of what happens when risk is imposed on others. The invisible damage could not be photographed, but it could be measured in lives altered and futures constrained. The nuclear age promised security. For these islands, it delivered uncertainty. Even decades later, questions remained unanswered. Who was responsible for long-term care? What defined adequate compensation? Could contaminated land ever truly be home again? These questions lingered without resolution. The Marshall Islands carried the weight of them. The tests had ended years ago. Their consequences continued every day. The damage was not dramatic. It was gradual. Decades after the last nuclear test, the Marshall Islands still live with its legacy. Some atolls remain unsafe for permanent resettlement. Radiation levels continue to be monitored by scientists. Certain areas are marked as hazardous zones. One of the most visible reminders lies on Atoll. A concrete structure known as the Runit Dome was constructed. It was built in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The dome covers a nuclear blast crater. Inside it lies radioactive debris from cleanup efforts. Contaminated soil and materials were sealed beneath concrete. The dome was never designed as a permanent solution. It was intended to contain waste temporarily. Rising sea levels now threaten its integrity. Cracks have been observed in the structure. Saltwater intrusion raises concerns about leakage. Climate change compounds existing risks. The Marshall Islands are among the most vulnerable regions to sea level rise. Nuclear contamination and climate threats intersect. Environmental challenges multiply rather than fade. Compensation agreements were established over time. In 1986, the Compact of Free Association was signed. It provided financial aid and allowed Marshallese to live and work in the United States. A nuclear claims tribunal was created. It was meant to address damages from testing. Thousands of claims were filed. The tribunal awarded compensation beyond available funds. Many awards were never fully paid. Legal responsibility became a point of debate. For survivors, time continued to pass. Health effects persisted across generations. Children of exposed parents faced increased medical monitoring. Some families migrated in search of healthcare. Communities spread across oceans. Cultural ties stretched across distance. Despite this, Marshallese identity endured. Language, music, and storytelling survived relocation. Elders taught history as lived experience. Younger generations asked difficult questions. What was lost could not be restored. What remained still mattered deeply. International attention occasionally returned to the islands. Journalists documented conditions. Scientists published new findings. Activists called for renewed accountability. The islands became symbols in global nuclear debates, yet daily life continued quietly. Fishing, schooling, and family gatherings went on. Resilience became a defining trait. Survival did not erase injustice. It coexisted with it. The tests are often described as Cold War history. For the Marshall Islands, they are living memory. Craters remain visible from the air. Contaminated zones remain restricted on the ground. Medical studies continue decades later. Some questions no longer have answers. Others still demand them. The nuclear age reshaped global politics. It reshaped these islands physically and culturally. Decisions made in distant rooms changed local futures. Those decisions cannot be undone, only acknowledged and learned from. The Marshall Islands stand as evidence of technological power without equal responsibility, of progress measured without consent. The world continues to debate nuclear weapons. Their legacy is often discussed abstractly. Here, it is concrete and personal. The land remembers what documents forget. The ocean carries traces of history. The people carry it within their bodies. This story has no clean ending. There was no moment when damage stopped. No single apology that restored what was lost. The tests succeeded by their original measures. They failed by human ones. The Marshall Islands remained inhabited. They remain resilient. They remain changed. Their future is still unfolding. So is the responsibility of those who altered it. History often records power. It less often records cost. This cost spans generations. It spans land and water. It spans silence and memory. The nuclear age promised security, delivered permanent consequence. The Marshall Islands live within that reality, not a symbols but as people. The tests ended in 1958. Their impact did not. It continues in Bodhi's land and law, and in questions still unanswered. What does justice look like after decades? What does repair mean when time cannot reverse? The legacy remains open, and the world is still living with it.